In this second part of the cellular respiration PowerPoint, we will be talking about the last step in cellular respiration called the electron transport chain. And then we will also go over a process in which some organisms or even certain types of eukaryotic cells can carry out a different form of energy production. So let's finish up the cellular respiration and the electron transport chain, or ETC, with what is happening. Okay, we have previously gone through glycolysis, and we have gone through the Krebs cycle. Now we are to the final part. And during this final part here, we will do in the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain occurs across the folds in the inner membrane called the cristae. So that is one thing you need to pay attention to that is different from the Krebs cycle. It does require oxygen. This is again aerobic. Aerobic meaning that it requires oxygen. Oxygen is going to be needed for this process to take place. What has happened, or what does happen, is that the NADH and the FADH2 that were produced during earlier steps of cellular respiration, mainly during the Krebs cycle, are going to be used to produce a different type of short-term energy carrier called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So we're going to take the energy in the NADH and the FADH2, and we're going to pass that on and create some ATP. It is important that you remember this, that one NADH molecule is capable of producing 3 ATP molecules, and one FADH2 molecule is capable of producing 2 ATP molecules. So when we go through the final production here later on, you'll understand where all the ATPs are coming from. Okay. The electrons from the NADH and FADH will combine with the hydrogen ions and oxygen to form water. So this is where our water gets formed that is released. Okay, so if you remember when we talked about the original equation for cellular respiration was glucose plus oxygen produces CO2 plus H2O plus some energy. It is during this part of cellular respiration, the ETC, that water gets produced. Excuse me. So, again, what happens during the electron transport chain? The NADH and FADH2 are converted into ATP. Prior to the electron transport chain, there had been 10 NADH molecules produced, and there had been 2 FADH molecules produced. Okay? In order for this process to take place, we're going to need 6 molecules of oxygen, and when that happens, again, we get 3 ATP for each NADH, so that gives us 30. And we get 2 from FADH2. So that is 4 more for a total of 34 ATP. Okay, and then we get as a waste product 6 molecules of water. So the majority of our ATP is produced here in the electron transport chain, 34 ATP. So let's look at our totals. Again, we go back to the very beginning, and this occurs out in the cytoplasm, in the cytosol, the liquid portion of the cytoplasm. That is called glycolysis, which literally means to split glucose. We produced 4 ATPs there. We got 2 NADHs. During pyruvate oxidation, this is the beginning of the Krebs cycle, we got 2 more NADHs. In the Krebs cycle itself, we produced 2 ATP, 6 NADHs, so you can see now we have 10 total NADH molecules, and we produced 2 FADH2 molecules. In the electron transport chain, we produce 34 4 ATPs. Okay, this is a grand total, if you add them up, of 40 ATPs. But there is something very important to remember, is that it took 2 ATPs to start glycolysis. So in reality, we are only gaining 38. Okay, we are only gaining 38 because, again, it took 2 ATP to start the process of glycolysis. Now, that is the number of ATP if everything went perfectly. That is not the case with the human body. On average, we really only get about 30 ATP out of each glucose molecules. Some of that energy that is going to be used into making ATP gets lost as heat or in other means. Okay, so again, on average, we make or get about 30 ATP per molecule of glucose. Again, glucose plus 6 oxygen, 2 ATPs will produce 6 molecules of water, 6 carbon dioxides, and 40 ATPs for a net gain of 38 adenosine triphosphates if everything works perfectly. Now, what happens if an organism does not contain mitochondria, such as prokaryotic organisms, or in some cases, our cells need to create energy because they are working so fast and they cannot take in oxygen fast enough, so they have to perform a form of what is called anaerobic respiration. In order to do that, these cells will carry out a process called fermentation, and you will learn as we go through here there are 2 different types of fermentation. The first of those is what we call lactic acid fermentation. This is a type of fermentation that commonly occurs in our muscles when we are performing very strenuous work in a very short amount of time, such as running a sprint on a track as a part of a track team. Okay, this results in lactic acid fermentation. We don't take the oxygen, or the oxygen cannot be used fast enough for respiration, so your body resorts to fermentation to provide a short amount of energy. Okay, fermentation can occur because it does not require mitochondria. Okay, this occurs solely out in the cytoplasm of eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells, such as bacteria. Again, as I said, it is anaerobic. Oxygen is not going to be used here. So there is no electron transport chain involved since there is no mitochondria. And it also involves glycolysis as a starting reaction to the process. And it is during this glycolysis that we actually produce our energy. Okay, again, as before, with cellular respiration, we're going to have 2 ATPs being used to help break the glucose down into 2 pyruvates. This will release 4 ATPs and 2 NADH molecules. So identical to what we had at the beginning of cellular respiration. This is where your energy production ends. So through fermentation, you are only gaining 2 ATP and 2 NADHs. Since we don't have an electron transport chain, we're not really gaining anything from those NADHs. So really, all we are getting from fermentation is a net gain of 2 ATP. The NADH, in turn, the energy from that is used to convert pyruvic acid into lactic acid. Okay, so we do not gain that energy from the NADH. It is in turn used to do a conversion of the pyruvic acid into a substance called lactic acid. Now, lactic acid does build up in your cells. Okay, it's what makes your muscles sore. Okay, if you continue to use this type of fermentation, your muscles will build lactic acid up and will become very, very sore. As a result, your body has to get rid of that lactic acid, and that does require energy from the cell. So we will commonly say that anytime you go into lactic acid fermentation, there is always going to be a payback later of the energy because you have to get rid of that lactic acid. Okay, so again, that NADH, the energy from that breaks it into lactic acid and NAD. The lactic acid then is broken down. This requires energy from the cell, and it gets it out of the cell and gets rid of the soreness. Usually this will take 2 to 3 days to occur. Second type of fermentation is called alcoholic fermentation. This requires yeast, or is commonly carried out by yeast. It, again, being a type of fermentation, is anaerobic, no oxygen is involved. It, again, involves the process of glycolysis. So, again, we are getting a net gain of 2 ATP. Again, the NADH that is produced during glycolysis is going to be used to convert the pyruvic acid, this time into a substance called ethyl alcohol. Okay, and when that does get changed into ethyl alcohol, in this particular style of type of fermentation, these yeast will produce carbon dioxide. Okay, this is the type of alcoholic or type of fermentation we see with breweries making alcohol of any type. Okay, we also use yeast could use this type of fermentation when baking. However, the alcohol is evaporated out, so that does not remain a part of the baking goods. Okay, again, fermentation is just a short-term answer for eukaryotic organisms. Eukaryotic organisms cannot rely on this full time. They do have to carry out cellular respiration. But because prokaryotic cells are so simple, they can get by on this little amount of energy. So that finishes our our cellular respiration and fermentation PowerPoint. You're going to now be doing a worksheet from your book over respiration and fermentation. And then this will be your last assignment for the 9 weeks. Have a good day.